My next guest is Hedreich Nichols. She is an author and educational consultant, helping teachers and districts amplify the voices of all students. With her solution tree title, Finding Your Blind Spots, 8 Guiding Principles to Overcome Implicit Bias in Teaching, Hedreich combines her experiences as a quote, one Black friend and educator with academic research and pedagogical strategies to ensure that educators have the skills and knowledge they need to create more equitable classrooms and campuses. Her 5 social justice titles with Cherry Lane Publishing further support these goals in the classroom. Her workshops and courses are highly sought after because she sees it as her mission to promote unity, even when teaching on topics are considered divisive. Hedreich received her Master's of Education at Texas A&M, and she is also a music educator. She was a music educator and a Grammy-nominated singer-songwriter. Welcome to the podcast, Hedreich.
Thanks, Dana. Glad to be here.
Well, tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Man, my life has had a series of trenches at some point or other. Let's see, how about a recent trenches moment? I'll talk about a student that I had who was really struggling. And, every now and then there's a student who really triggers you as well as a human being. And we had that kind of a constellation. And she was a middle school student, but she would have almost toddler massive meltdowns, just and finally, when I stopped trying to make sure that she was regulated and be, the authority in the room, when I finally gave her some space to gather herself, to, I see this is difficult for you. Let me have you step outside. Why don't you take a quick walk, grab some water, and come back? And when I began to give her some trust and support, as opposed to doing my very best to steely, by sheer will to get her to regulate, things began to change. And so we even set up a signal so she could just say, Nichols, I got it. Okay, fine. Go ahead and go. It's all right. And so little by little, we built a really strong relationship out of that. And the next year, it was funny, when she was having those moments in the other classes, she would come and say, hey, can I please just work in your room? I got kicked out. Said, let me check with your teacher. And if they say it's okay, then yes. And, we have a back check channel, of course. And that was always okay with other teachers. And it just really allowed me to see that sometimes, I don't even know how to say, sometimes really just building the relationship little by little and trusting someone, as opposed to being angry at them for disrupting your lesson, makes so much better. And so she was, even now, I've seen her a couple of times out in the city, and she's Miss Nichols. It's just, and I would have never thought that the first couple of months that I had her in class. And I'd go home stressed every day.
Well, it is building that strong relationship and finding what works with the student, right? And like there, you had to let go of your control. You had to let go of some of those tools that you'd used in the past. Really find out like what she needed.
Because I'm old school, mean and scary. That didn't phase her at all.
Yeah. So I talked a little bit in the bio. You have Small Bites LLC. So you provide keynotes and PD courses for schools and districts on equity, restorative justice, and student engagement. So talk to me a little bit about what you do on a regular basis in your consulting with schools, maybe what the greatest need is a lot of districts have, and how you approach your work.
2 very different questions. How do I approach my work? Really from a half researcher, half personal point of view. I think that a lot of my experiences as a student, as a teacher, as a campus leader, and as a parent led me to the work. And then I approach it in a way that honors. I'm going to use this phrase because it was absolutely awful. Donald Trump once said, there are very fine people on both sides. And this was after something very awful
Yeah.
had happened, and the country was looking for him to condemn one side or the other. I think that should have happened. But when I think about that thought,
Mm-hmm.
almost everybody, even the most evil person, is usually doing things because they want a better world for their children. They want
Mm-hmm.
better
Mm-hmm.
for the new generations than they had themselves. Those kinds of things are common to us all. And so the way I approach the work is that there are no evil people. They are just people doing some wrong things for some probably very good reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so that allows me to tap into some empathy, to understand logic that I might find in, with my group of coffee girlfriends, completely illogical and even heinous. But it
Mm-hmm.
allows me to approach that doesn't help. You know what I mean? Judging
Yeah.
their behaviors is awful, does not help. Acknowledging that in that horrible crowd of people, there were parents who were doing the best that they thought they could do for their kids.
Mm-hmm.
And when you realize that, if you can get to a place that is
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
there, you can maybe talk to someone in a way that will allow them to understand why some of the choices they're making are detrimental.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, no, that's a really interesting perspective to put on that. And I think it is difficult for people to kind of see it that way, right? When there's so much division in the country. And you work with districts on topics that might be divisive in some areas of the country. So how, if you're working in certain areas like that, do you approach um, different districts in a different way? And do they have ideas of how they want to implement equity work or even just restorative justice work in their schools? Or is a lot of you trying to guide them through that process?
There are a couple of different I can't call them strands,
Mm-hmm.
approaches. There are a couple of
Mm-hmm.
different approaches. There are people who are already on a journey, who are doing work on their campuses, in their classrooms, and have some idea about how to create more equitable spaces for their students. And then
Mm-hmm.
there are people who are perhaps brought to this work because they have an overrepresented a representation of students in SPED who are people of color, or students
Mm-hmm.
who are in exclusionary behavioral situations who are students of color. And those two groups of people definitely need two different approaches. For the people who are there because the state said, hey, you guys need to do something, y'all are not doing good for other
Mm-hmm.
populations, you have to really find that empathy piece.
Mm-hmm.
There's just no way, because for me, I'm coming in as the quote unquote woke lord, and I'm some black kid, some black woman who just wants to try to tell people that they're bad and they need to feel guilty. And I know what the
Mm-hmm.
wall already is, so I've got to find that empathy piece. One of the things I mentioned is, for example, um, a child who's told, hey, guess what? You're going to be a big brother or a big sister.
Mm-hmm.
And that kid's like, well, why? I'm the baby. I don't want anybody else. And we talk so often, for example, about white males. And
Mm-hmm.
we talk in a way that is, if you are a white male, unkind.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, white males have had the power in this country for centuries.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you never thought that you were doing anything wrong and you're not a bad person, all you see is suddenly you're the bad guy. In every
Mm-hmm.
room, you're the bad guy. And that's got to be burdensome as well. And so, how do
Mm-hmm.
we acknowledge those thoughts in a way that allows people who have been in power traditionally to
Mm-hmm.
also see what the other side looks like? So
Mm-hmm.
there's that approach, and again, tapping into the empathy is really important on that one. And on the other side, the empathy is, yes, there are victims. Yes, there are consequences that are of Jim Crow and slavery and separation that are still impacting communities today. And no, we shouldn't have to wait another 50 to 100 years for things to change.
Mm-hmm.
However, you cannot drag somebody to change. What can
Mm-hmm.
we do?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? So those are the two things. What can you do, and what can you do to make sure that you don't just make folks mad,
Mm-hmm.
and so that they
Mm-hmm.
can't hear you? Because the bottom line is, many of the people who have the most power are not interested in this message. And
Mm-hmm.
so got to you've got to be more concerned about making sure that you're heard than just saying all the facts or telling
Mm-hmm.
all the, all the things that are going on, because those are not the things that will get people to hear you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like the talking about like see it from all sides, right? There's having empathy for where people are, where they're coming from. Um, don't necessarily pinpoint a population as the bad guy, right? Um, so I think you talked to me a little bit in the pre-chat about the fact that we also want to make sure our teachers are trained in best practices when we're looking at equity policies and restorative practices. So, if we're working in a school that's trying to have a better approach, and we have teachers, a lot of turnover, and there's a lot of people coming from different schools that may not have that background. How does a school approach this? Do they have a school-wide training, or what would they do?
Um, my district actually does do school-wide trainings, and I've heard lots of positive things about it. What I do think is I like having affinity groups on campus, because nobody can represent everyone. And when there are affinity groups, then people are allowed to say, these are the issues that I face on our campus as a Black woman, as an LGBTQ person of non-binary gender. When you have those groups, you get a whole lot more input from people who are really affected by the policies and protocols on a campus. So I like affinity groups. I do think that just some basic ideas, Finding Your Blind Spots, is a book that I've seen used over and over at campuses in a book study, because it's basically uh, Inclusive Classrooms 101. It really touches all of the important places that teachers need to be aware of: representation, whose stories are missing inside curriculum, what are the proper words that you use. For example, I saw there's a new policy that is giving $75 million to um, Native American nations who are being affected by climate change. And everybody said Native tribes. Everybody, several of the news outlets said Native tribes. And Native tribes is a phrase that's it's a little dodgy, because if you recall Disney, the natives are coming, the natives are coming. And so Native tribes kind of connects to some real stereotypes behind, Native American culture. Whereas if you say even Native American tribes, or, indigenous peoples, indigenous communities, those things don't necessarily connect to, what do you call it? Slurs of the past.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
And
having common, API, a lot of people don't know that that's Asian American and Pacific Island. So just having some general trainings on things like that, on what misgendering does and how to
yeah.
support your LG students, all of those kinds of things. So yeah, definitely some whole group training for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of maybe schools, maybe not districts in general, but when you're doing it at the school level, sometimes they miss that mark, right? They have the overarching kind of equity meetings or trainings, but like really diving deep into proper wording, how to know maybe some of the um, um, you know some of how like you said, how when it comes to gender and pronouns, things like that, or AAPI, like acronyms, things like that. Like not everybody, especially if you're new to education, or if you're new like in the working space, like young people that are coming in may not totally be aware of like how to approach that. So I definitely think that's really important. And you did mention, so your book, Finding Your Blind Spots, you said is used a lot in book studies, but you also have written some children's books about anti-racism and Black Lives Matter. So talk a little bit about those. Sorry, you're muted.
There we go. Sorry, I was coughing a little bit. I love talking about those because those are banned. They're both on banned book lists here in Texas. And so I kind of feel pretty important that my books were important enough to ban, but probably they haven't been read. It's just the titles and what is anti-racism and what is the Black Lives Matter movement. Those titles automatically call into question what are we doing to indoctrinate our children? So I love those because they're explainer books. And I've actually had adult book studies with what is the Black Lives Matter movement and what is anti-racism. And it's because I often say that being on the side of right does not make you win arguments. Knowing how to win arguments makes you win arguments. And what Black Lives Matter was not the best choice of a slogan. Imagine if they had used Black Lives Matter too.
Mm-hmm.
Just that small addition would have made so much difference. It wouldn't have been an either or. It wouldn't have felt like an either or to people who felt like it was an either or. But I in the book I talk about Black Lives Matter really just means Black Lives Matter too. And I talk about how it's important statistics, and it's written for grades 4 through 8 about, and it's really great, like I said, for adults who are new to it or who feel the concept is divisive, not necessary, that by bringing it up, we're actually being divisive, those kinds of things. And so I wrote both of those, that one and what is anti-racism, just to explain the concepts, to give kids a chance to do some extra work on their own, knowing what it means to be an ally or to be supportive or how to stand up for someone. Again, very practical things, not just conversations and knowledge, but real practical things that kids can get engaged in, that teachers can get engaged in, and that anyone who's reading or listening to a podcast about it can say, oh, wait a minute, that's a little something that I can do, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think there's really not enough of those books out there for kids in school libraries. And I know, like you said, it is kind of like in a way it is a little bit exciting, like you said, in parts of the country where you live, that they can be on that banned book list, but for areas like where I live and work, where they are able to have those in the library, I think there's not enough information for kids to access that kind of explains it, like you said, maybe say two, adding that adverb to the slogan, right? But just breaking it down for kids at that age. And, they've heard the slogan, but really, what does it mean? Diving more into anti-racism and, what does that mean for kids in this day and age? So, and people can access, get those books anywhere, Amazon, and where books are sold. Are they, are either the children's books, scholastic books?
No, they are Solution Tree, not Solution Tree, I'm sorry, Solution Tree is Blind Spots. Cherry Lake Publishing, also huge imprint. So Cherry Lake and Sleeping Bear Press, that's from that imprint. And so you can get them on those websites and of course Amazon. And there are three others that are also explainer kind of books about Black history. One is about Black centers of wealth like Tulsa. One is about excellence in STEM with a lot of even current mathematicians and science heroes. And the other one is about the Harlem Renaissance.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and when we had that 100-year, like last year when we looked back on the Tulsa Race Massacre and talked about everything that we found out, and now that they're building memorials and things like that, and just thinking back to me growing up, and I spent a lot of my childhood in Tulsa, and that was not mentioned in school. Right?
I mean, even now, and that's why I say, it's easy for me to say there are two people who actually went after reparations in court. They're still alive from the Tulsa Massacre.
Wow.
And the city has been reluctant to give anything at all. And so that's when I say seeing empathy of both sides, I thought, okay, I started doing a land acknowledgement because I do my podcast from my house. And then I thought about it. So what would reparations look like? Well, what if someone from the Caddo tribe came and knocked on my door and said, thanks, we heard you did your land acknowledgement. We're here to reclaim our land. You know, what's, you know, I think that's a great thing and we should give land back. But do I want to be homeless? Do I, you know, what does that look like for the people who have to give the land back? And so while I recognize while not even recognize, while I intensely feel the victimization that occurs as a part of a um not at the top of the totem pole of power person, I also have to recognize that when someone is in power, when someone is king of the hill, there are also thoughts and feelings that go along with that. And yeah.
Yeah. And then kind of looking back and saying, the reparations need to be done, but also like, there are houses now and there's neighborhoods and like this land, the immigrants, the Europeans took it over and then, the land has now been developed. So it's like, what do we, that's a whole other topic, but yeah,
Exactly.
kind of looking at that.
It's way more complex. You
Yeah.
know, it's just in principle, it was stolen land. We got to give it back. But if they come knocking on our doors,
yeah.
What does that mean? What does it look like? How can we do this? So yeah.
So you mentioned you have the podcast, Small Bites. So what is your podcast mission? And do you interview others or is it mostly you speaking?
It's mostly me. I do special interviews. I did a wonderful one with Kevin Lightman, who is a burnout researcher. And he gave some wonderful tips for people so that people can hopefully stem some of this flow of exodus coming right after Christmas. Might be a little late, but just that kind of thing. But generally, it's about me. And the mission is really just to provide 5 or 6 minutes of strategies that people can implement right on it drops Sunday night for 5 a.m. for Monday morning.
Okay.
And hopefully there's something that can be heard that can be easily implemented, not just conversation or a thought, but something that they can really put into practice and become better practitioners.
Is this something you plan out kind of the topics, or does it just come to mind kind of throughout the week and that's what you're going to talk about?
Both. It's more usually I try to be relevant to whatever's happening. But then I have certain things that I definitely like. I have a topic list that is ongoing and I'll pull from that. But almost always something comes up during the week and I want to talk about. So it's really
I mean, it can be difficult though to keep those 5 minutes. Do you sometimes run over and speak for 20 minutes?
If I did, like, for example, the interview with Kevin went about 20 minutes and I just did two 8s.
Okay. So you really like to keep that time frame. So those are just snippets, for those people who have short commutes and, they expect, it's going to be short.
Yeah. And it's a kind of a sweet spot somewhere between TikToks and a full-blown podcast.
Okay. Well, it was great having you on and connecting with you and talking a little bit about your work. Out of everything we talked about today on the podcast, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
That you can always get out of the trenches. That the cool thing about being down is there's nowhere to go but up. As long as you're living, just get up and keep trying. And like I said, we talked in the pre-chat and I talked through several things. I talked how it was after I lost a husband in a foreign country before the age of 30, and getting up from that was so difficult. And I just finally practiced a lot of gratitude, sometimes for just the smallest of things, and kept walking. And so I'm here.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, it's just move forward and be thankful for what you have. Well, where can people connect with you?
Oh, the neat thing is that my name is very unique. H-E-D is in Dora, R-E-I-C-H, Hedreich. And if you can spell that, you can find me. My website is hedreich.com. My handles for all my social media are at Hedreich on LinkedIn, Hedreich on Twitter, Hedreich on TikTok, all of that. So learn to spell my name.
Great. Well, I'll make sure I post those in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for being on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure having you on.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Dana.